The Civil Rights Movement was one of the most impactful events in U.S. history. Although being influenced by culture, religion, and politics alike, the Catholic Church was no exception. Now we know what you're thinking. The Catholic Church didn't influence the Civil Rights Movement. It wasn't even mentioned in our history class. And this prompts our research question. Did the church have a notable impact on the Civil Rights Movement? Our reasoning for choosing this event in the church's history was due to it being a time where even the most differentiated of individuals came together in a time of need. Furthermore, this time period within the United States history was one that truly challenged the ideals of the Catholic Church, with those in the South in particular.
Civil Rights Act isn't really documented throughout history textbooks or taught at all, thus leading us to the story of the church during the Civil Rights Movement. It all started in the early 1950s when a major event that sparked the movement was Rosa Parks and an NAACP member failing to relinquish her seat at the front of the bus to a white man. Not only was this a turning point for the movement, but it was a huge jump for the church, showing good Catholics an example of what they should do to lead the movement as well. Before the act was passed in 1958, the American Catholic bishops state that they were completely against segregation and we are calling for racial justice. This was a testament of how the church would be ruling on the movement. And
to answer our question, we first need to look at the church's initial reaction to the introduction of desegregation within the United States. Throughout the church within the South, de facto segregation ran rampant. This was a means of practicing Jim Crow laws by belief and not law. An example of this would be in Anderson R. Bentley's Prelates, Protests, and Public Opinion, Catholic Opposition to Desegregation, 1947 through 1955, where it reads, Catholics in the state of Louisiana, on two different occasions, attempted to thwart desegregation in the church, page 617. Furthermore, his scholarly article also continues to display Louisiana Church's initial reaction to this new legislation through a sudden moment of defiance. With this being a hasty response, the text states that church officials quickly addressed the issue, threatened ecclesiastical sanctions, and the protest movement never materialized. Page 617 through 618. Although this resistance was present, in J.P. Dolan's The American Catholic Experience, it reads that to be out on the front line publicly demonstrating for social justice was something new for Catholic priests and the religious. Page 447. This demonstrates the church's initial hesitancy alongside their attempts to thwart the movement. This was the case. It was noted that it did not take long before a, quote, priest or nun standing on the picket line or participating on a protest march became quite a common sight, page 447. This goes to show the church's initial reactions, initial action, and eventual development in the civil rights movement.
although the church had initially resented the movement, it was not long until many influential priests and bishops like Albert L. Fletcher of Little Rock and Thomas J. Tulin arrived to the scene. Fletcher was the fourth bishop of Little Rock and was also highly supportive of the desegregation movement, aiding the protesters to the very best of his ability. In the 1950s, he called for a desegregation of Catholic institutions, as he and his successor, Andrew J. MacDonald, were the primary leaders of the Catholic Church in Arkansas. Furthermore, his works were also referenced by the Pittsburgh Catholic. When interviewed, author Robert Sensor mentions that he did use works from many impactful people, with one being Fletcher. Alongside this, he also mentioned that he felt optimistic about the future, nothing that today those crusading for desegregation far outnumber those crusading against it. This goes to show Bishop Albert L. Fletcher's notable impact left behind by his works, and that he also contributed to the rise of desegregation in the civil rights movement.
Alongside Bishop Albert L. Fletcher of Little Rock, there was Archbishop Thomas J. Tulin, yet another supporter of the movement. It is mentioned that during the riots in Birmingham, he was noted by the Catholic transcript to have said, "As Catholics, we cannot harbor hate in our hearts for our Negro brethren," page 3. Furthermore, it's mentioned that under his leadership, there was a tremendous increase in participating people from the clergy, quoting that, "For many, one of the most striking aspects of the current drive for racial justice has been the growing participation of clergy and religious in civil rights demonstrations," page 3. Alongside his exceptional efforts in protesting the movement, Thomas J. Tulin is also noted by Clarion Herald to have mentioned that, quote, "We have well over 1,000 adult converts each year, and more than half of them are usually colored people who dearly love the church," page 3. Here, Tulin shows his sympathy and reasoning for supporting the movement despite the cost. As noted by the Catholic transcript, one of his mentioned provisions was the call for, quote, desegregation for lunch counters, restrooms, and drinking fountains at downtown department and variety stores in stages during the next 90 days, which was permanently granted in the 1960s.
Within the New Catholic Encyclopedia, it talks about another extraordinary clergy member, Archbishop Rummel. He was the first Catholic bishop in the South to accept African American students into his seminars. On March 15, 1953, Rummel made history by offering desegregation within the Catholic parish with his pastoral letters. "Blessed are the peacemakers." This shows how this Catholic parish stood on the issue and the noticeable impact this specific parish made by pushing their agenda of desegregation. Rummel was able to help help influence a wide variety of people and overall help impact the civil rights movement by slowly swaying people to the church's side of the matter.
When applying our data to finding the marks, themes, and models of the church, we determined that the church's initial attempts to thwart the protests follows the theme of church and state, as it shows how the Southern Church initially began to deal with the now looming presence of desegregation. In addition, the positive involvement of the church also continues to represent the previously mentioned church and state, as through Robert Senter's book, Primer on Irrational Justice, he is noted to have been able to acknowledge that desegregation was finally on a roll, while also referencing the works of Catholic civil rights supporters such as Bishop Albert L. Fletcher of Little Rock. The Vatican II document, Nostra Aetate, states that all people are heading towards the same goal, and that, quote, God made the whole human race live over the face of the earth. With this being published in the 1960s, it could be implied that this could have been done in response to the civil rights movement. This is because it does not mention the concept of race or religion, but instead speaks to humanity equally. This relates to our question by showing how God made the whole human race not to fight and constantly contest with each other, but to find peace with one another. Our question is how the church impacted the civil rights movement, which ultimately did bring peace and allow everyone to love one another. The Nostra Aetate is nearly a mirror to our answer, showing how the clergy thought in the 1960s, voicing their opinion on how the church stands, and the view it sheds on all who have faith with the church and believe that what they are doing is fair and just.
Throughout our research, we've discovered the Church's original position on the civil rights movement and how even a few influential clergy members were able to have a massive impact upon specific parishes they resided over. Though there was some backlash within the Church, especially within the segregated South, as some people found it wasn't quite as easy to accept a completely new way of thinking whilst others easily could. The Church had a large impact upon the civil rights movement by working with the religious people within their parishes to start making change. For example, Bishop Albert L. Fletcher of Little Rock worked throughout his leadership in the Catholic Church in Arkansas in order to call for the desegregation of Catholic institutions. Furthermore, Thomas J. Tulin also contributed throughout his continuous statements as well as his calling for change within his noted provisions. Then finally, with the last notable figure being Archbishop Rummel, for his acceptance of African American students. To summarize, the Catholic Church had an initial resentment for their response towards appearance of desegregation. Although this was the case, over time, the Church was able to change and eventually contributed to the cause, with their continuous presence in the protest being an influential force in itself.